All right, juniors, this week we discussed the relatively thorny issue of free will, which was, if you will, a culmination of three different topics that we discussed. First, we talked about divine knowledge or divine intellect. Then we talked about divine will. And then, after all of that, we discussed free will, whether or not we have it. What are the theological implications if we don't have it? What are the theological implications if we do have it? And then we also circled back to talking about whether or not God has free will. It's an interesting set of questions. One of the first things that we talked about in class was the apparent statistical anomalies that occur if we do have free will. It seems very odd that humans are as predictable as they are. That's interesting. If we had free will in the sense that we could just make any choice that we felt like at a given moment, and we were inclined to be able to choose both within our ability, we would expect such statistics to not occur. We would expect it to be almost impossible to track on what humans are going to do and what they're not going to do. But instead, we find that humans are relatively predictable on a number of issues. But then we also examined the problem that comes up theologically and indeed philosophically if humans don't have something like free will. Now, a strict materialist, and I would say a strict materialist need to be atheists in most situations. There are maybe a few that would say that they're not. A strict materialist, someone that says there's no immaterial things like form or like God. Such a person would have to say that there is no free will. Because everything ends up boiling down to material parts, and these material parts are such that they can't be construed in another way, and one just leads to the next infinitely. And so most atheists who are strict materialists, and it's many of them who are going to recognize that there's no such thing as free will, technically speaking. Although they would recognize that it certainly appears that things look free, they would say this is merely just an illusion. Some Christians have taken this route, and I see why they want to take this route, right? They see that we are usually, the way that they would go about doing it is by looking at the effects of our sin, how it's completely blinded us, how we need grace in order to be able to rise up from our sin, grace of God, a gift of God, as we've discussed. And then they would conclude, therefore, it seems that if we're going to be technical, we don't have free will in the way that we could typically conceptualize it. I argued for going a slightly different route in this class, which is not to say, I guess that we don't have free will, but instead to say, let's be careful what we mean by free will, right? If we use free will in the colloquial sense, it's actually quite difficult to defend from any perspective. And yet we still want to say that parts of it are important. And my way out of it is actually to say, let's maybe redefine or reimagine what free will means. And it's not really so much a reimagining from the ground up, but a reimagining back to what was typically meant by free will, especially prior to the time of figures in the Enlightenment such as John Locke. All right, with that little preface, I wanted to discuss briefly, go back to the conversation about divine free will. I was reading, in preparation for some of this, an article by a woman named Eleanor Stump, who is someone who's done a lot of research on Thomas Aquinas. Many people disagree with her findings and her readings of Aquinas, but I find some of her points to be really interesting and salient for our present purposes here. Specifically, she looks at many of the consequences of divine simplicity, namely that God is simple. His act is pure. He does not have things such as potency or a distinction of essence and existence or parts in a technical sense. And similarly, goodness and being are entailed by one another. In fact, they're not just entailed by one another, such that where one is, there the other must be. But they actually are more or less exchangeable from one another. We might mean slightly different things when we use each term, but we're really talking about the same thing. And ultimately, this will come down to talking about God. This brings up some interesting problems that Stump notices, and in particular, one of the ones that she points to is the fact that Aquinas and many other medievals like him, but especially Aquinas, are going to be very comfortable with the idea that God could have not created. And indeed, he could have acted differently in human history. Well, why is that a big deal? Well, think about it this way. If I am one simple part and act, or we don't even need to make a hypothetical for me. If God is one simple act, then the question maybe stands, could he have acted, and I'm using act in a slightly different way here, but could he have acted differently, or could he have done differently? Now, for a lot of theological reasons, I think we're going to want to say yes, that he could have done differently on some things. We could have had different interactions with him. He is able to act freely in some unconstrained way, even if this free acting is not different from who he is. And yet, the question comes up, well, where does this sort of freedom come from? For Aquinas, he's going to put a strong distinction between God's will, as we mean by his necessary being. That is, he wills goodness. He wills that which is good. This is necessary for God. And so because it's necessary and it could not be otherwise, Aquinas is a bit hesitant to say that it is. In fact, Aquinas is going to strictly deny that this would count as free will. Why? Well, it's not just that God wants it, but it's that God could not have done otherwise. And I presented an interpretation class which is slightly different from this, though. But if you follow the argument, I think you'll see where it's going. So God could not have done otherwise, which is acting in accordance with himself. And therefore, his will is just equal with himself. But Aquinas wants to recognize that's not all we mean by what we say when we say God's will also. He also wills just what he does in and of history. And because God exists outside of history, or outside of time, we're not talking about the incarnation at this exact moment yet, but when we say that God exists prior to time or before time, we're going to have to also come to grips with the fact that this means that whatever he does in time, he does it, in a sense, timelessly. So we could still say that as he interacts with Adam and Eve, or as he interacts with Moses, or as he interacts with XYZ biblical figure, or even as he interacts with us, we could say that he does so in a necessary fashion. Why? Because it's the way that he's already acted. And indeed, with God, because he is existing outside of time, we could talk about what happens in the future in the sense that what happens currently in the present moment. But Aquinas would distinguish this from God's will, which is in and of himself, which could not change. And he would say that this will as it interacts with creation, is of such a quality that it could be different in, and then this is where it gets a little challenging, in another possible world. By this we mean just like a world that's logically possible. And this brings up a whole bunch of potential problems, but ones that are worth opening up because they're going to allow us to have a little bit more clarity, even if we are to disagree with them. And I will say on Eleanor Stump's position here, I'm not sure that I agree with her, but I find it extremely interesting. She recognizes that for Aquinas, the difference between a substance, right, that which stands underneath, and an accident, that which is added onto it, is not just simply that a substance could exist with multiple different accidents at different times as long as it continues to persist, which is a common way of defining substance, but instead is something that stands as the base of something else. Indeed, it has a different mode of being, and we've talked about that with the analogia entes from the very beginning of all of this, the analogy of being. So let's put that into terms that we've used to discuss in this class. The wall exists differently. It is differently from the grayness of the wall behind me. And so she would say that the grayness is an accident not simply because it exists on something else, but because it exists on a different plane of being. And so, too, when we talk about God's existence, we mean that his existence is on a different plane of being. Now, it's possible that his existence, that his will can be thought of in two different spheres. That which exists necessarily according to his nature, i.e. his goodness, and that cannot change. But consequently, that cannot be called a free will. And then, additionally, that will, which can change, but is still on a different plane of being from that of accidents, or even, as we would think of, as substances, because it is the divine will. This can change, but can only be thought of as logically distinct from God. That is, it is still one and the same will, albeit in a manner that can change, maybe in a different possible world. It won't change here, and so in that sense, it exists necessarily because it has happened outside of time. And so our language even fails to grasp it, right? I just said it has happened, but that implies that it happened in the past and was completed. But technically speaking, this is not true for God's will. But she simply means that it could have been, Eleanor Stump means that it could have been that God willed not to create. And this would not change who he was or who he is. This is going to also present an important reason for affirming the Trinity, right? Because we also will, of course, want to say that God is love. He is not dependent on creation in any way, and so he must be eternally loving himself in a way that is not improper, right? In a way that he can actually love multiple persons in himself. Otherwise, this would be probably just a profound act of what we might think more of as selfishness, but at very least would be lacking some of the best qualities of charity. So Stump is going to use this long argument to talk about how, or not this long argument, but this rather complicated argument to talk about how God's will, as we experience it and encounter, has some sort of contingency to it. It's not necessary in the sense that it could not have happened in any other way. But it is still the single and divine will, which is unchanging. That's a rather lofty thing to think about. I think it's worth contemplating, though, because it's going to get to the really essential questions that we're asking in this class, right? Namely, if we want to conceptualize God as simple, and I think that we should, what are some of the implications for that? Can those implications be overcome if they seem challenging to Christian theology? Or are they insurmountable? So I would encourage you all to, as much as you're able to grasp onto these things, I will attach Eleanor Stump article to the Canvas, and I would encourage you to read it. I would encourage you to look through it. I think you have enough of the vocabulary where you will be able to actually understand most of it, if not all of it. And I think it's a good thing to do. Since I'm already at about 13 and a half minutes, I think it would be good to stop this video here and do another video where I actually summarize free will as we discussed it in class. And as we discussed it in class, I looked at the importance maybe of redefining what we mean by free. This will be in contrast to the view that I just articulated by Eleanor Stump. But it's okay to be thinking of multiple explanations of the same thing. And indeed, I think it will give you a better understanding of it. So feel free to watch that video as well. Hopefully, this will continue to get you to think through all the implications of what we're working through as best as we can. All right, I will see you in the next video.